Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Biblequest study here at the Bethany Christian Church. We are working our way still in the Old Testament, and today we're going to be looking at two of the most fascinating books in the Old Testament, but completely different, quite different from each other. And they are the book of Esther and the book of Daniel. Now, the book of Esther is a short book from a scroll that is the one that is read to celebrate or to and initiate the Jewish feast of Purim, which usually happens in January, February in our calendar, in what's called the month of Adar in the Jewish calendar. And it's an interesting book in several ways. One, God is never mentioned anywhere in the book. The name, that is, the name of God is never mentioned anywhere in the book. And some of the most precious things that we associate as part of the Jewish religion are not mentioned in it at all. It is, however, an interesting story, and it's more legend than it is history, although there are some scholars have seen some possible historic references in it. But it is the story of a living of the Jewish people outside of the Promised Land, in this case in Persia, and is the story of a man named Mordecai and his adopted daughter Hadassah, who becomes called Esther, who comes to be called Esther, and is given the name in this book. And it's a rather exciting story. It includes a beauty contest. Esther is picked to be the woman to replace the former queen of Persia, whose name was Vashti. And when Vashti is sort of deposed for not appearing before King Ahasuerus, they look for another queen, and they have a sort of a beauty contest, and Esther is the one who sort of comes through and ends up as the consort queen for the king of Persia. And it's a very sort of a story with irony and all kinds of things. It's a very story of a very subtly planned anti-Semitic pogrom. The bad guy in this story, a man named Haman, he wants to get rid of the Jews and their influence at all in Persia. And as it turns out, as you read this exciting story, he eventually loses out, and what appears to be really his worst enemy is Mordecai and Esther. They win out, and from that victory of Mordecai and Esther, the Feast of the Purim, as part of the main Jewish feast festivals, is developed. And so this book is about that. Now, as you read it, you'll see it's full of coincidence and sort of, in other words, it's a made-up story. It's a legendary story that is designed to show it has its place in the Old Testament canon, because it shows what it meant to live close to God, living in a country where there was no Jewish power whatsoever. And it also shows how strong devotion is part of the lives of both the Jewish people in the Old Testament, as we shall see, for Christian folk in the New Testament. So as you work your way through this, it's a relatively short book. You'll get the feeling that it's a story rather than history. A very exciting story, by the way. A story with a good, happy ending, and a story that raises our spirits and inspires us to live in a way that we would not otherwise understand when we see the problems that Mordecai and Esther have to deal with. So enjoy this relatively short book. It's just a good read, and I don't think you'll have any trouble at all understanding it. It's set there in Persia, and it has some sort of Hebraic translations or transliterations of Persian names that might appear difficult at times, but stay with it and you will enjoy the reading of that book. Now, the next book that you have to read is a completely different book, but an equally exciting book. It's the book of Daniel. And Daniel is a special book in the Old Testament because it is an apocalypse. It is a book of looking into and interpreting the future. It's different than just prophecy. It's looking ahead into the future. The only book like it in the New Testament, of course, is the book of Revelation. So that apocalyptic book, Daniel in the Old Testament, and Revelation in the New Testament are the two really main apocalyptic books. And Daniel has its own unique structure. It's really set up in two sections. And the two sections have their own importance and their own excitement. It's really, in the first part of it, the first section is 6 different tales, if you will, or stories that tell us about Daniel and why he was considered a wise man and how he was able to make himself known in the time of the Neo-Babylonian kingdoms because of his strength and for his ability to remain close to God and not be swayed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And the stories that you read in it are wonderfully exciting. The first one is very famous, where Daniel is, one of the captivity prisoners now living in Babylon. And these are princes' sons. These are important men in the Jewish tradition, but now these young men are in the Babylonian Empire, and the king wants these young men to be part of his household, and so he has, the best food for them and so forth. Well, Daniel, he asks the head of the sort of catering service, the eunuch who's responsible for taking care of these young princes, he says, I would rather not eat the king's food, the rich food, and drink the wine and so forth. I would just like to have vegetables and water. And boy, it's a scary thing for the eunuch. He says, I'm afraid if the king thought that I was not giving you the right stuff and then you looked poorly before the king, I would, end up losing my head. Well, the wisdom of Daniel begins right there as a young man. He said, look, let me and my friends eat just the vegetables and water for just 10 days, while the other people in the things eat the king's food, and go ahead and compare us then and see what you think. And of course, at the end of 10 days, they look better. Their flesh is cleaner and clearer, and they are handsome young men. And so, not only does the eunuch not force them to eat the king's food, but he gives the vegetables and water and so forth to the other young men that are in the king's group. And that's the first of these sort of 6 stories. Now, a couple of the other stories are very famous, and I only need to mention a couple of them, and you'll have fun reading them. One, of course, is Daniel in the lion's den. Every child learns that story usually at a young age, and this is the book where that story is given to us. Also is the famous story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the 3 young men who discover that they will martyr themselves rather than be guilty of apostasy. And we get that wonderful story of the fiery furnace, and these men are thrown into the fiery furnace, and when people look in, they're standing inside the fiery furnace, and there's an angel with them, and they're perfectly all right. They're cooling it in the heat of that furnace. What a fabulous story that is, and how what a good read it is. When I was a young boy at church camp, I had a teacher who said to help us with these names, he said, these guys' names are Shake the Bed, Make the Bed, and To Bed We Go. And he used to say that to us every night. But it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What a wonderful story that is. We also get the story of Belshazzar's feast and the famous writing on the wall when Belshazzar is doing things, prideful things that are not that he should be doing, and he's dishonoring the God of the Hebrews by the way he uses their vessels of gold and silver. It says that, just like one of our modern science fiction tales, a hand appears in the banquet hall and writes on the wall a message, and nobody can interpret it, but Daniel is brought in, and he's able, as the wise man in the kingdom, to interpret it and to make clear what is going to happen, which, by the way, is good for Daniel but bad for King Belshazzar. Anyway, it's a very, very interesting book. And as I said, there are 6 of these stories that most of them we have heard of at one time or another. And we have that, they make up, those 6 stories make up the first half of the book of Daniel. Now, the second half of the book of Daniel is really where we get the apocalyptic part of it. There are a series of visions, 4 different visions that are given in the book of Daniel, and Daniel's able to interpret them and make clear the significance of them in the future. They're very powerful. They're much discussed, of course, because people say, well, I think what he means here is this, or he's talking about Hitler over here who's going to be in the future, or whatever. All kinds of things. So take your time reading the book of Daniel. Esther is an easy read. Daniel, the first part, those stories are wonderful, but those apocalyptic visions, they're a little bit more complex. You'll have to take your time and be careful reading them. And most of all, make use of the films that come out from Bible Project that are readily available. They're each about 6 minutes or sometimes 7 minutes long, and they do quite interesting animated, illustrated explanations of these books, and they're very helpful when it comes to understanding, for example, the apocalyptic section of the book of Daniel. So, I don't know where you are in your reading, but if you are keeping up to where we are, We are coming now to really the end of the Old Testament. We have just a couple of more minor prophet books to look at, and then we'll be moving to the New Testament. I hope you have been noticing that the thrust of the interpretation of the Old Testament is pointing forward to Jesus, pointing forward to the Messiah, pointing forward to who's called the Anointed One, the Christ, all of these words. And that's where we're going as we come to the New Testament. So, anyway, enjoy your reading. I think you'll particularly enjoy Esther, and certainly the exciting stories in Daniel. And then you'll have those interpretive sections to work with as well. Keep up in the reading, and don't forget, if you are having trouble, don't be afraid to call us here at the church, at Bethany Christian Church here in Arapahoe, and we'll try to point you in the right direction if we can, if you're having some kind of particular problem. All right, that's all for today. Let's have a word of prayer and to bless our study and bless our continued study as well. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity we have to read and study the Bible. And we particularly thank you for the fact that there are scholars in the world who are there to help us and are making things more readable for us in our study. We thank you for them, and we ask you to bless them and bless us as we continue our study here in the Biblequest at the Bethany Christian Church. These prayers we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.